Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Connected Data, Linking Preclinical Data to Commercial Outcomes for Patients Today. It is presented by Wu, Engagement Manager at Ernst & Young. My name is Judy O'Rourke, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We're delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking website and producer of educational virtual events and webinars. Before I begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want during the presentation. Simply click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and type your questions into the drop-down box. Our speaker will respond to your questions via email following the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're experiencing a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located in the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Wu. I will now turn the presentation over to him.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today as I have an opportunity to tell you about how data today is more connected than ever, especially looking at preclinical data all the way through to commercial and patient outcomes. So the content I would like to go over today is really looking at the evolving value chain. I think this value chain is something that you are probably very familiar with. In order to talk about how data is changing kind of the value chain that we look at today, I would like to show you some models of a little bit about our past and also what are the trends of the future. Secondly, I would love to talk about the lab of the future and what does that actually mean in terms of the implications to data. And I'm sure this is a buzzword that you've heard, but in terms of this conversation, I want to frame it around how does the lab of the future impact the number of data and data points that I think we can be collecting, especially in the clinical space, and how does that inform commercial and vice versa. And in section 3, really looking at how the analytics landscape has really boomed and shifted, with some case studies to follow in section 4, especially about Novartis and what you guys have done in order to really engage and partner in this space to provide more insights and analytics to the work that you guys are doing. And then finally, with section 5, looking at what are the impacts of real-world evidence? How has real-world evidence changed items that we look at today in terms of informing the type of clinical studies we do and how we commercialize for our patients? To start us off in section 1, just to norm everybody, I really do want to talk about the value chain of pharma in a very high-level way, in addition to what are some high-level buckets that are changing, especially as we look at Pharma 2020 and beyond. So looking at here, just taking a focus on, let's just say, oncology, for example, you can see that in traditional pharmaceutical landscapes and value chains, we really look at it in, I would say, 2 pieces, where you start with something like a target lead in preclinical, and of course, that is followed by phases 1, 2, 3, filing, commercial launch, potentially a phase 4, etc. So that's something that I think many of us sit within different pillars or verticals in our business. However, as you see and as you know, in this more evolved version of pharma, there are a lot more players despite the value chain staying very consistent. However, how the interactions happen between each step within pharmaceuticals, there's a lot more connectivity that's required and a lot of data that's generated to supply that connectivity. So what I mean by that is when looking at molecular discovery, you still have the target lead and preclinical space, of course, before phase 1, 2, 3, filing, commercial launch, filing phase 4. But there is a lot more partnerships today in terms of sharing data and understanding what are the large academic centers doing. And for this example, let's just take oncology. And what about the startup space and the biotech space that is in that really stands out and is different from traditional pharma? As we know, in the last decade, or at least in from 2010 on, the amount of biotechs that spun up, the last 10 years has really boomed comparatively to before, where, prior to 2010, we were looking at large pharmaceuticals dominating, I would say, most of the revenue and spend. However, with biotechs now, although their spend on R&D, for example, may not be obviously as high as a traditional large pharmaceutical. However, the amount and the number of different biotechs that exist today, at least let's just say in the US, has really, I think, tenfolded when looking at 2000 to 2010. And then, of course, how are we leveraging CRO sources as we think about phase 1, 2, 3, when we think about filing? How are we looking at using CRO either in preclinical and in clinical in order to partner in parallel to complete clinical trials? How do we share that data? How do we make sure we maintain that data's efficacy to make sure that if it's used for filing, et cetera, how do we relay that back to each other? So the necessity for us to really understand what is being done outside of our sphere, our internal systems, is definitely a data complication that we did not see as much in this traditional pharmaceutical value chain, let's say 10, 20 years ago. I think one of the drivers, as you see on the left, is really a integrated laboratory technology across many disease areas. I think this is something that we are going towards understanding. Well, if we are going to look at different disease areas, if we were going to look at preclinical trials, target lead, et cetera, in a holistic way to move us to use things like predictive analytics and big data, we need a launching off point in order to understand all the data in some sort of orderly fashion. So those integrated lab technologies, how do we capture things all in live time? How do we report on live time has been a boom and driver, I think, in this new pharma-involved value chain. Of course, this notion of fast to failing, if we can use data to increase what we know, then we can decide on what is going to be successful versus not earlier is something that we can always recoup on time and cost, which has been a hot issue, I think, for many years now. And then obviously, lastly, licensing to implement therapies. How does what we do in the preclinical space really impact how we think about licensing and how we impact on how we go to market in terms of clinical to commercial, what kind of therapies that we want to put in the competitive landscape that is today. And some of the items that we know for therapy implementation on the right side, which is looking at the clinical phase 1 through 3, and especially filing and commercial launch. How do we streamline different commercial and clinical data together so that we are reporting on, or if we do follow-up clinical work, that there is a healthy feedback loop to see what happens in commercial back to clinical and back and forth. Because right now, traditionally, as many know, due to regulatory agencies, there are blinding, unblinding, and there are data that can or cannot be shared. But if the data can be shared, how is it housed or how is it structured in a way so that the flow of data stays integral and is easy in lifetime versus siloed and kind of in chunks of areas, I would like to say, which is more common today or a common challenge that's faced today. And then lastly, post-commercial launch, let's say 18 months out, if you're collecting real world data, what are the inflection points where you can plug this real world data in and look at, okay, if we have efficient outcomes with real world data, where can we actually pivot and make changes in a structured flow-like model when it comes to the data? I think one key thing before moving on is really to understand where in this process are we looking now to really elevate the outcomes and thinking across your disciplinary area. So if you're in preclinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, to think across your disciplinary area, knowing that the data that you generate will also transcend past, I think, where it's created. That's something that's very different than when we think about traditional pharma, which is we collect for our vertical, and then once that time limit is achieved and the data amount is achieved, we can pass that on, decide if that makes it to the next phase. So this waterfall phase gate approach now has a lot more integrated and connected feel because the data between all of them is starting to tell a different story instead of passing it along like a baton or a relay. So this takes us really into section 2, which is talking a little bit about Lab of the Future. And obviously this session is not about the Lab of the Future, but I do want to pull out implications because Lab of the Future does talk about very early clinical work. So how does the very beginnings of data generation affect everything downstream? So going into the next slide, really, I think Lab of the Future has 4 major components, as you may know: the design and configurations, advancement in process design, advanced technologies and enabled labs, and of course, employee empowerment. I think today for this conversation, I think 2 things that I really want to focus on is really the advanced technology enabled labs and also the advancement in process design, because it is those 2 areas where it kind of controls the amount of data that's created, where this data lives, how is the data created, what is the hygiene, structure, architecture, because those are things that we didn't look at as often in this Lab of the Future, pre-Lab of the Future space, because we never thought about this data really being updated through different feedback cycles or provided to others outside of at the end of our study. So I think when we think about designing for Lab of the Future, sure, lab design configuration, making sure that different teammates from areas of work are together integrated. The top left and the bottom right, I think, are areas that are very important. But for this discussion, I think looking at what assets you have early on that enables analytics and predictive analytics, even if you have a feedback cycle and say, okay, well, if we do this today and we are building the architecture today in this way, how are we storing data, sharing data, integrating data so that 3 years out, 5 years out, when the data comes back with real-world evidence or when it passes or fails phase 3 or phase 2 clinical trials, how is that coming back to us to inform our future builds of preclinical for future lines of molecules and studies? So I think really thinking about laboratory of the future, those components really dwells on the fact that once we go beyond what do we do in our own vertical and what data is necessary, we also think about how is data coming back to us, what data points are coming back to us, and how does that inform different decisions that we would or would not make based on additional capabilities. I think I've said many buzzwords up until now. I think one of the largest things that we think about is, or we don't think about, is how is the data structured and what are the inputs? Because in order to really harness the power of any sort of analytics, there has to be some sort of base or platform for everybody to integrate their data. And having a research background, I know that between disease areas, between different compounds, between different offices or locations or countries, the way we interact with a very manual or systematic or the process of generating insights could be very different. And I think as we look into this new pharma-enabled connected data ecosystem, we really need to think about how are we all doing maybe not the easiest thing, but the most standard thing, so that all our data can be harnessed in one place and to look at in one kind of cohesive real-time manner versus, manual crunching of data, integrating, and, one time a year, because the data that we need to make our business decisions, let it be preclinical or commercial, needs to be more timely than that, as the demands from market pressure is much greater than once a year or even once every quarter. So I think the 3 things to pull from that is really, as I mentioned, advanced technology that's omnipresent in navigations informed by an app or a management system or a platform rather than a human or a person. So really making sure that there are things that are safeguarded and shielded versus real-time data aggregation and reporting, which is something I think I've said a few times now, which is really understanding the shifting focus of how data is collected so that it can be used and harnessed throughout the progression of a clinical trial and feedback after we know the longevity of, let's say, that trial. And then lastly, data collaboration across the value chain. Where are areas where you would like more data up or downstream, depending on where you sit, in addition to what type of data would that be and how would that inform your decisions? Let it be a go, no-go, or let it be enhanced patient outreach or a certain type of patient outreach or a type of commercial model to combat, market forces and competitors in that space. This really moves us on to section 3, which is looking at the analytics and partnerships. So we talked a lot about where data can sit, what kind of data can be generated, how is the pharmaceutical value chain very different than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. But I do want to just share with you in a small kind of POC setting, proof of concept setting, which is just looking at the number of vendors that sit within some of these verticals. Obviously, this is definitely not exhaustive. You can see the number of analytical players or health tech companies or biohealth companies that may not be a direct competitor to, let's say, Novartis. They're not producing any drug, but the amount of data they're producing to support certain pipelines of drugs has really expanded in the last, let's just say, 5 years. So I'm not going to go into each one of these, but as you can see, I put color coding to look at what types of data they're looking at. And it gives you, I would say, a flavor of what kind of data, could be coming to different various verticals within the value chain, in addition to what type of areas do they really harness data? Let it be a population health monitoring after treatment, or a diagnosis and patient profiling? Is it a referral pattern item, or maybe is it early detection and prevention? I think what is great that I wanted to pull, and specifically for this audience, is to really understand there are a lot of different partnerships that have already taken place. And looking at this landscape, you can see various names that you might know in the large pharmaceutical top 10 big pharmas, today. But what I did want to highlight is some of the wins that Novartis has taken in terms of understanding where do they want to play with big data. So you may know that Coda Healthcare, Motif, IBM Watson, Shift Analytics are all things that Novartis have put capital allocation to partnerships to help us get generating, greater real-world insights, tailored evidence-based cancer treatment interventions to support more strategic R&D spend. In addition to things like the Shift Analytics and Novartis partnership, really looking at how data is customized between the interaction of oncologists and payer providers. And then lastly, of course, this bucket that we haven't seen anything with Novartis yet, which is individualized cancer care solutions, to look at how do we manage point of care when it comes to cell and gene therapies, for example. So this gives you kind of a flavor of landscapes of people already partnering with different technology or health tech companies to provide more data insights to see how data really is connected. So it really goes beyond just kind of the walls and borders of your company, as these strategic partnerships really will bring the new wave of competition, how you use that data to enter the market and to stay competitive in the market. I think moving on really quickly, I think this is just another view. I think it's a lot less busy in terms of a landscape. This is just a very clean slide that looks at what are the advanced analytics and AI generating evidence-based insights. And there are the three that I listed, which is Novartis Shift Analytics, which is really looking at intuitively the analytics for driving decision-making for commercial teams. And I know this is a very high level, as we don't want to get too detailed into it, but it's something that you can ask questions about in the comment box. And of course, the Novartis Coda Healthcare kind of partnership, which is looking at leveraging Coda's analytics platform, optimizing outcomes for really just the breast cancer patient line. And then, of course, the IBM Watson and Novartis, which you may have heard about. And the objective is really to equip oncologists with evidence-based answers and expected outcomes about, again, the breast cancer treatment process, so they can make the most informed decisions with data about other patients and other things that Novartis and IBM Watson has aggregated when we look at data. So this moves on to section 4, which is the 2 Novartis case studies that I've put together. I would like to go through one, and of course there's a second one for you to look at in the downloaded materials. But just to highlight one, I think one that I do want to talk a little bit more is the Novartis and Coda Healthcare partnership. As you may have heard, this really solidified in March of 2017 with a multi-year agreement focused on just the U.S. landscape. What they're using is they want to use the real-world evidence that's generated from cancer treatments in the breast cancer space to really help with things that they are still doing clinical trials with. So additional clinical trials, additional indications, additional work that is still being done despite commercialization of one indication of the product, I think is the feedback loop that I'm trying to highlight today of just showing how data is more connected than ever than what it was, let's say 10 years ago. And really the purpose is to optimize clinical and cost outcomes for the breast cancer by identifying patients who would benefit from it most. So instead of our traditional line of, let's say, target accrual for clinical trials, looking at what other factors do we need to know about the patient to really optimize both for us the data that we're hoping to seek to gain from the clinical trial, in addition to what other items will we need to know to say, yes, based on real world evidence, we know that these patients or these type of patients receive our may receive XYZ better, may respond better, may have more clinical success. Therefore, reproducibility would be higher / not, I guess the breadth and reach of our clinical trial that we may have to show may not be as great because we're substituting real world evidence in order to kind of help this process along. And I think one thing I do want to mention, I know it's quite bulky down there, but one thing I do want to really talk about is CODIS technology. So you might think about, okay, so yeah, that sounds all really great. But I think how we are actually doing that from a data perspective is CODIS technology is actually running, and in the system, they can stratify patients. So based on patient outcomes, they can stratify patients based on attributes of the prognosis and significance from the original onset to post when they start feeling certain types of responses to the treatment, and all of that is tracked and aggregated. And when we look at things that two patients, let's say, are experiencing that result to, let's say, a positive outcome, what it can do is it can look at, what type of patients they are, where are they located, how are they referred, the organization of pairs that surround them, what are the discrete properties between these two patients, 3, 4, 8, 12, as data aggregates, and what are the insights you can glean from those to show that, it doesn't matter if they are in, Louisville, Kentucky versus, Portland, Oregon, or, Miami, Florida. It doesn't matter based on geography, but based on certain key metrics that we're seeing with real-world evidence or evidence from health outcomes, we can say that, patients that fit this prototype or, model may respond better based on the data that we've seen with current patients. This helps, as you may know, to inform the type of clinical trials that we would need to do, or how do we use real-world evidence, which I'll get into the last section, to really bother with different regulatory agencies like the FDA in the United States to say, if we have this real-world evidence, then we would not need to reproduce certain key pieces of clinical trials, but use that as a supplement and continue our clinical trials maybe with a different fit. On the next slide, I'll flash really quickly, but the second case study I put together is the Novartis and Shift Analytics, which just closed about mid last year, which really is looking at third-party and proprietary commercial data once a project is in the commercial space. But for time purposes, I think I will leave this to you. And if there's questions about this one that you want to ask, of course, feel free to go into chat box and engage there. But to move on to really looking at real-world data in the fifth part of our conversation today, which is really looking at real-world evidence and guidance on the future. So how does the evidence that we generate with outcomes really guide us in how we do what we are doing today across all verticals? Before getting too deeply in that, I do want to just share something high level. Not everybody may know where are the inputs for things like real world data today. And of course, this list is not exhaustive as this grows, every couple of months. I think there are different inputs that we can have in the real world space. But I tried to bucket it in kind of 4 areas to help us understand for this conversation purposes. But of course, there are things like direct data, indirect data, patient data, and provider data. Granted, the visual that I put together isn't exactly quadranted like that, but I think help us think about the types of input data that would fit under the real world, buckets. I'm really thinking about direct data being consumer level data, wearable data, pharmacy data, I think are all things that really touches upon the consumer itself who's receiving the treatment in the direct data space. Of course, then you look at them as patients. So patient data, of course, are diagnoses data, electronic medical data, survey data that they either take during clinical trial, after clinical trial, during their treatment, or after the treatment, or as they're finishing up the treatment. Of course, provider data, I think that is the most, I think that's the easiest to understand. So it's really understanding the hospital data, any additional pharmaceutical data, pharmacy data that we have, claims data that's filed between payer and provider, I think are important data pieces that is now informing us on how we do things within our value chain in the pharmaceutical landscape. And then lastly, indirect data. If we have things about social media, social listening, data in different platforms, the laboratory biomarkers data, mortality rates, data, I think all pieces together into what we look at with patient centricity and understanding real world evidence in this space. So I do want to go in and look at how really the amount of full-time resources to really look at real world evidence, or just the thought of collecting real world evidence has really increased across, really, if you think about it globally. I think the rate of increase based on economic pressures, economic factors, way hospital networks, payer provider is governed within each country, maybe a little bit different, but breaking up into US, Europe, emerging markets, and just global as a whole, you can see a trend within 2013, 2015, and 2017. Now, obviously, the amount of FTEs that's spent, where their time is spent looking, generating, accepting, using real-world evidence has grown. I think something that's very noteworthy is that I think even though US may be a late adopter to outcomes-based treatments or the leveraging and the use of real-world evidence, or RWEs, has really, I think we were the slowest to adopt, but our growth has been the highest in the last couple of years. As you see, this data is from 2013 to 2017, versus I think Europe has had a higher consumption rate, but they've had an inflection point between the 2 years. And then, of course, emerging markets has grown quite a bit as well, in addition to globally as a whole, looking across the whole scope. You can see the trend is growing from 15, 20 to 23%. So as you know, the amount of allocation thinking and connected use of data is definitely growing. So how do we use things generated post-commercial insights throughout all of our verticals is something that everybody in the industry is spending more and more time thinking about, as it's not only a time savings, but it's also a cost saving and labor savings, a understanding that we are being more efficient in the way we do our business. And then lastly, I think just for the simplicity, bring it back to, I would say, this pharma evolved or this next gen pharma landscape. What I just put here is just really easy tabs of where real world evidence is usually generated. And of course, this is not exhaustive and very high level, but what are some common inflection points that we are seeing across the industry where people are leveraging real world evidence, let it be, in the verticals that we know, preclinical through phase 3, how are we generating real world evidence with large cancer centers versus sharing that evidence? So we are it's a two-way communication street. We're both getting smarter and being more involved in the way we look at how we generate insights and patient outcomes. Same with the biotech and IP space. What are biotech spending up? What do they care about? What kind of CRO partnerships are they making versus are you making as big pharma? I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to gather and use things like real world evidence. And of course, each one of these can be drilled down, multiple slides deep to look at exactly where in clinical phase 1, exactly where in preclinical, et cetera. But I think just to connect it to the very first slide we talked about, which is this evolving pharmaceutical value chain, I think this overlays well with where real world evidence may be used or may be generated. I think, and finally, as we wrap up today, a lot of people come to us and we have conversations with what is this process that you've heard a lot about data, the uses of data, how it's evolved, different verticals within the value chain. how are companies making partnerships, what type of partnerships, what kind of data is collected, are all topics that we talked about today. But really to understand what are the common challenges if you're like, yes, like that's something I want, but where do I go from here to where I am today? I think common challenges that we support and we've seen with a lot of our clients is this unstructured input data, which makes it impossible to really aggregate efficiently or effectively. There's too many input sources. Right now, it's 100% manual. The location of these items, this idea and this notion of a single source or even a single platform is something that is not consistent, or I guess it's a big daunting task to think about where does all this data live. And then of course in pharma we look at what systems are GXP bound, what are customly made just for us, so not a straight out of the box solution. Also, what are some personal platforms like SharePoint, personal drive, G drive, Z drives, whatnot, that we're saving, storing, and collaborating with this data. I think makes it difficult to kind of see the whole landscape in one kind of full-blown swoop at a time point. And of course, because of that, data is often siloed and not mapped correctly. Naming can become a problem. Even the same data can be called 600 different ways between different systems, let it be manual or automated. So unless you are a deep data wizard, you may be looking at two columns of data, which is portraying the same type of data, but you may not even know that due to the way that data is siloed and then mapped and remapped. And then lastly, although we may use data innovation, but really it's a non-sustainable point solution. So there is a target in mind. We bring in this partnership, we collect this data, it gives us this outcome, but it's not a sustained across all disease areas. It's something that's not across all brands. It's done kind of, I wouldn't say in silo, but at the point of need and kind of completed more as a task than something as a sustainability platform that we look across all areas and we do across multiple lines at the same time. I think what we look at when it comes to next steps, if you are suffering from some of those items, is of course, I think to get to that point where your data is connected as best as possible to inform insights throughout the verticals within the value chain, is obviously map the current existing data processes, data landscapes to create something streamlined so you know where the inputs, inputs and outputs are, and to look at where can you aggregate, where can you streamline, and where can you reduce maybe 50, 60 sources into, I would say, 2 or 8, right? Really create opportunities to leverage feedback data. So where in your process today would you want, and what type of data would you want in order for you to inform? I'm sure you've gone through areas where you've thought, wow, if I've had this type of data, or if this type of data was available for me at this point, I would be able to make a more informed decision on going with X or Y due to XYZ factor, right? So I think the approach 20 years ago and how we do our business with data and understanding and the connectivity of data is very different. So doing what we've done 20 years ago that's worked may not be working today. And then, of course, lastly, to build automation to enable data sharing. So this is not a manual task, as really the manual task that we should be focusing on would be the science, safety, efficacy data, regulatory data, real-world evidence collection, patient outcomes, et cetera, not manually pulling spreadsheets or sending it over email or whatnot. But how do we build automation and AI to create business questions, KPIs, and answers for us, or to share data stream in a streamlined and efficient manner between different disease areas, between different clinical studies, brands, etc. So thank you so much for embarking on this journey to talk a little bit, very high level, of course, on the different ways that data is more connected than ever today through the different value chains between clinical phase 1, preclinical, clinical phase 1, all the way to clinical phase 4 after launch, and real world insights. If you have any questions, my bio page is also in this deck that you can download. In addition, feel free to comment and any questions you have on the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Wu, for that informative presentation. I'd also like to thank LabRoots for making today's educational webcast possible. Before we go, I want to let everyone know that this webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through May 14th, 2019. And as a final reminder, our speaker will follow up with any questions you've submitted via email. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next time. Goodbye.